The document is open on the screen. He hasn't moved in several minutes. Not because he's frozen. His hands are calm, his shoulders are level, his breathing is slow and even. He looks, from the outside, like a man reading a quarterly report, like a man reviewing a contract, like someone doing the ordinary, unremarkable work of a Tuesday evening in a quiet house. But his eyes have stopped moving. There's a specific thing that happens when your mind encounters something it isn't built to process. It doesn't shatter. It doesn't go dark. It does something stranger than either of those things. It slides. The words are there, fully formed, printed in the clean, authoritative font of a medical laboratory that charges a great deal of money to tell you the truth. The sentences are grammatically correct. The terminology is precise, and yet the brain keeps skating off the surface of the meaning like water off cold glass, refusing to grip, refusing to land, refusing to let the information actually arrive. He reads the same line 4 times. The 5th time, it arrives. And from the next room, clear as anything, bright as a bell on a winter morning, a small boy's voice cuts through the silence of the house. "Mama, where is my red truck?" He doesn't move. He sits with the document open on the screen in front of him. Somewhere in the walls, the heating system ticks and hums. Outside, a car passes. The world is going about its business with a kind of breathtaking indifference, the way it always does when something inside a person has just shifted permanently off its axis. The genetic lineage of the man reading this document is not present in these results. That's what it says, not in those exact words. The language is clinical, percentage-based, framed in the careful neutrality that science uses when it delivers the kind of news that lawyers will eventually need to discuss. But that is what it means, stripped to the bone. The child in the next room, the boy who calls him Dad, who demands his red truck, who last week fell asleep against his shoulder during a movie and left a small damp patch on his shirt that he didn't wipe away for an hour because he didn't want to disturb him. That child did not come from him, not biologically, not according to this. And yet, he is that boy's father in the way that counts for anything real. He was there for the first word. He was there for the fever that spiked to a terrifying number at 2 in the morning and sent them racing through empty streets to an emergency room. He is the one who learned, through patient and sometimes comical effort, exactly how to make the specific version of scrambled eggs the boy will actually eat. Not too wet, not too dry with cheese, but only if it's melted all the way through. He knows the particular pitch of the cry that means scared versus the one that means angry versus the one that means tired, but refusing to admit it. He knows these things because he showed up every single day and paid attention. The paper says none of that. The paper says something else entirely. He sits there for 43 minutes. He knows this because he checks the time when he first reads it, and he checks it again when he finally exhales. A long, slow, deliberate breath that he releases like a man who has been holding it underwater. 43 minutes. He does not break anything. He does not raise his voice. He does not slam the laptop shut or put his fist through the wall or do any of the things that the movies have trained us to expect from a man in this moment. He just sits, and from the next room, he hears her answer, the boy. Her voice is soft, patient. She tells him to check under the couch. She says she thinks the truck might have driven itself under there because trucks sometimes do that when no one's looking. The boy laughs. That specific, unself-conscious laugh that children have before the world teaches them to perform it, and he hears small feet on the floor as the search begins. He sits with that sound. He sits with all of it. But to understand what that silence cost him, and what, in the end, it was worth, we have to go back. We have to go back to the man he was before any of this, before her, before the boy. Before the version of himself he had been quietly, persistently convinced belonged to someone else. We have to go back to the beginning, which is not where you might expect it to be. Welcome, everyone. If you're new here, I'm so glad this story found you tonight. And if you've been here before, you know how we do this. Pull up a chair. We're going to be here a while, and this one is going to earn your time. Drop in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's in the room. And if no one's told you to subscribe yet, now's the moment. Hit that button and come all the way in, because if you've ever felt like someone quietly took credit for the person you worked hardest to become, If you've ever looked at your own life and wondered which parts of it were actually yours, stay with me tonight. This one is going to hit close. His name is Callum Hale, and before we can understand what he did with those 43 minutes of silence, we need to understand who taught him to be silent in the first place, and who, much later, would be the reason he finally decided to stop. Pull that chair a little closer tonight. Get comfortable. Because this story isn't about losing everything, though it will feel like that at moments. This is about discovering what was yours all along, even when someone else tried to convince you it belonged to them. If you're new here, welcome. You found your way to this fire at exactly the right time, and I don't think that's an accident. If you've been here before, you already know how this works. We don't rush these stories, we don't skip the parts that matter, and we stay until the story is told properly. So drop in the comments and let me know where you're listening from tonight. I read every single one of those, and there's something grounding about knowing who's gathered here while we go through this together. Whether you're watching from a quiet bedroom at midnight or driving through somewhere with the volume turned up, I'm glad you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that button because you're going to want to be here when we get to where this story is going. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what Callum Hale did with those 43 minutes of silence, you first have to understand the man he was before the silence was ever necessary. And to do that, we need to talk about the Hale fortune, because the money is not incidental to this story. The money is the stage on which everything else plays out. The Hale name had weight in the way that old wealth always does. Not loudly, not flashily, but with the particular gravity of a thing that has been accumulating for long enough that people feel it before they can explain it. Callum's father, Edmund Hale, had spent the better part of 4 decades building something that deserved to be called an empire without embarrassment. Shipping contracts that moved goods across 3 continents. Waterfront real estate in cities that other developers had written off too early and regretted later. A diversified portfolio managed with the kind of patience that the modern financial world has largely forgotten how to practice. Edmund was not a man who chased trends. He was a man who watched them, waited, and then moved when everyone else was already exhausted from running. Callum inherited all of it at 26, when a sudden illness took Edmund faster than anyone had prepared for. And then Callum did what a certain kind of young man does when he finds himself standing on top of a mountain he didn't climb. He looked out at the view, felt nothing in particular, and walked in the opposite direction. Not out of cruelty. That's important to understand. He wasn't trying to destroy what his father built. He wasn't making some deliberate statement of rebellion. He was simply a man who had never been given the chance to be hungry for anything, and so he had developed, in the absence of hunger, a kind of permanent restlessness, a low-level static that he couldn't tune out and couldn't quite locate. He moved through his late 20s the way a person moves through a room when they can't remember what they came in for, quickly, with apparent purpose, arriving at the far wall and turning around without quite knowing why. The penthouse in the city was his most honest biography during those years. He threw parties there with the casual frequency of someone who has stopped noticing that parties require planning. They filled themselves, the right words in the right ears, and by 10 o'clock on a Friday the place was full and loud and bright, and Callum would move through it all like a man doing a very convincing impression of someone having a wonderful time. He knew most of these people the way you know the furniture in a hotel lobby, by sight, by function, by approximate location, but not in any way that would survive a long conversation in a quiet room. They were there because of what his name opened, what his address signaled, what proximity to his particular orbit was understood to be worth. He knew this. He kept them around anyway, because the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't actually see you is, in its own strange way, easier to carry than the loneliness of a room with no one in it at all. His father's advisors, men in their 60s with careful eyes and conservative suits, had learned to tighten their jaws and say very little when Callum made decisions they considered impulsive. The waterfront development, in a city 3 time zones away, that he committed to after a single site visit. The stake he took in a technology startup run by a 23-year-old who could talk brilliantly about disruption but couldn't read a balance sheet. The private charter company he bought on something close to a whim, then ran with genuine enthusiasm for about 4 months before the enthusiasm moved on without him. Some of these decisions lost money. Some of them, against reasonable expectation, made money. None of them were made from strategy. They were made from the need to feel something directed, to aim at a target, any target, just to have the sensation of forward motion. He wasn't reckless in the way people use that word to mean careless about consequences. He was reckless in the more specific sense of a man who has not yet identified what he actually cares about enough to protect. And there is a difference. The first kind of recklessness is a character flaw. The second is a state of waiting, even if the person doing the waiting doesn't know that's what they're doing. Because here is what none of the jaw-tightening advisors and none of the penthouse crowd ever took the time to see. Underneath the restlessness, the instincts were extraordinary. When Callum paid attention, truly paid attention the way he did on the rare occasions when something caught and held him, he was capable of the kind of focus that moves markets. His father had known it, had written about it, in fact, in the private journals that Callum wouldn't find until much later. "The boy sees things," Edmund had written in his careful, unhurried handwriting. "He just hasn't decided yet that what he sees is worth acting on." Edmund had been patient about this. Edmund had believed, without apparent doubt, that the deciding would come. What Edmund hadn't accounted for was how much damage a man can accumulate while he's still in the process of deciding. And sometimes, this is the part that will matter later, so stay with me. Sometimes a lost man, when he finally hits the current that was always running through him, finds that the strength of it surprises him, finds that he was built for it in ways he never had to discover because no one had ever asked him to swim. The current was always there. He was always capable of it. He just needed the right confluence of circumstances to stop drifting and start moving with purpose. And sometimes someone steps in front of that current and calls it their river. We'll get to what that means. We'll get to who did that and how and what it cost everyone involved. But first, I want you to sit with the picture of Callum Hale at 29, standing in the middle of everything his father built, surrounded by people who wanted pieces of it, running a company he hadn't chosen, and a life that fit him the way a suit fits a man who's still growing. Not broken, not bad, just fundamentally, quietly, waiting to be found. You ever met someone like that? Someone who was running so fast and so constantly that they had completely lost track of the fact that they were already standing on solid ground. Someone who had everything they needed to build something real, but hadn't yet found the reason to stop moving long enough to build it? Drop that in the comments for me. I genuinely want to know, because I think more of us have been that person than are willing to admit it. And I think understanding it in Callum is going to make the rest of this story land somewhere important. He was 29 years old. He had more money than he had ever had to think carefully about. He had a name that opened rooms and a face that kept people in them. He had his father's instincts and none of his father's peace. And he was about to walk into a situation that would take every single one of those qualities, the wealth, the instincts, the restlessness, the capacity for focus he hadn't fully used yet, and put them to work in ways he couldn't have predicted. Not all of it would be good. Not all of what came next would be clean or simple, or something he could look back on without cost. But it would be the beginning of the real story. And the real story starts with a woman who was not, under any circumstances, looking to be saved. The gallery opening was on a Tuesday in October, which is the kind of detail that shouldn't matter but somehow does. There's something about a Tuesday, the most forgettable day of the week, the day that exists only to hold space between the beginning and the middle, that makes certain moments land differently. No one expects their life to change on a Tuesday. There's no psychological preparation for it. You're just moving through the hours, and then suddenly you're not. The space itself was one of those converted industrial buildings that old money loves to fund and new money loves to be seen in: exposed brick, concrete floors polished to a shine that costs more than it looks like it does. The lighting was warm and deliberate, designed to make everything, the art, the people, the small plates of food no one was actually eating, appear slightly more significant than it might under ordinary circumstances. The air smelled like cedar and white wine, and the crowd moved with the particular rhythm of people who have attended enough of these events to know the choreography without thinking about it. pause here. Tilt your head at this angle. Hold your glass, just so. Callum was there because his name was on a donor list somewhere, which meant invitations arrived whether he wanted them or not. He had learned, over the years, that it was sometimes easier to show up for 45 minutes than to deal with the follow-up calls asking if everything was all right. So, he showed up. He moved through the room. He said the things you say at these things, which is to say he said very little of substance and smiled at the appropriate intervals. And then he saw her. She was standing in front of a canvas that took up most of the far wall. Dark, almost entirely black, except for a single thread of gold running through its center like a vein, like a fault line, like something that had cracked open just enough to let light through. The painting was the kind of thing that could read as pretentious or profound, depending entirely on who was looking at it. Most of the people in the room had given it a glance, nodded thoughtfully, and moved on to something easier to discuss. Camilla was not glancing. She was looking, really looking, with the kind of attention that suggested she had forgotten anyone else was in the room. Her head was tilted slightly, her weight shifted to one hip, her arms crossed loosely in front of her in a way that was composed without being closed off. She wasn't performing interest for anyone who might be watching. She was simply interested. And the difference between those two things is visible if you know how to see it. That's what he noticed first. Not her appearance, though she was striking in the way that people are striking when their mind is visibly engaged, when thought is happening behind the eyes rather than performance. What he noticed was the quality of her attention. The way she gave herself completely to the thing in front of her, without any apparent concern for how that looked from the outside. He found himself walking toward her before he had decided to do so. And when he stopped beside her, not too close, not imposing, just present. She didn't turn. She let him stand there for a full 30 seconds before she spoke. It's the only honest piece in the room. Her voice was low and unhurried. She still hadn't looked at him. What makes it honest? He asked. It's not trying to be beautiful. It's just trying to be true. She finally turned, and her eyes were steady in a way that suggested she was accustomed to looking at things directly. Most of the work here is performing something. This one is just stating a fact. There's gold in the dark, that's all. Take it or leave it. Callum laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes out before you can decide whether you want it to, and it startled him. He couldn't remember the last time something had surprised that sound out of him in a room like this. I'm Callum, he said. I know who you are. There was no particular weight to it, no flirtation, no accusation, just acknowledgement of a fact. I'm Camilla. They ended up on a bench near the coat check, which is where you go when you've decided the art is secondary to the conversation. 2 hours passed in a way that felt like 20 minutes. She was a school administrator, she told him. A position that involved more politics and more exhaustion than anyone outside the profession understood. She spoke about her work with the measured care of someone who had learned that words, once released, could not be recalled. Every sentence was chosen. Every observation was precise. She was, Callum realized, genuinely intelligent, in a way that had nothing to do with performing intelligence for an audience. And she understood something that most people didn't. She understood the particular loneliness of rooms full of people who only want pieces of you. She named it before he did, the way everyone at events like this was calculating proximity, measuring access, trying to position themselves closer to whatever they thought you had that they wanted. She had seen it in her own world, she said. Smaller stakes, but the same dynamics. Everyone wanting something. Everyone performing a version of themselves designed to get it. It's exhausting, she said, being someone's means to an end, even when the end is reasonable, even when they're not wrong to want it. The exhaustion is the same. Callum felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. This woman felt, in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like rest, like a room with the pressure removed and nothing expected of him. Like someone who was looking at him rather than at the Hale name, the Hale money, the Hale everything else that came with the package. He asked for her number. She gave it without hesitation but also without eagerness. A transaction conducted between equals. They made plans to meet again, somewhere quieter, somewhere without the performance. Now, here's where I need you to pay close attention. Because what looks like a love story from one angle looks very different from another. Keep watching. What Callum could not see, what he had no framework for seeing because he had never encountered it in this particular form, was the other layer of that evening. The layer that existed underneath the genuine conversation and the real connection and the obvious intelligence. Camila was intelligent. That part was true. She was also observant in ways that went beyond normal attentiveness. She had noticed him the moment he walked into the gallery. She had positioned herself in front of that particular painting because she had watched him long enough to know where his attention went, what kind of thing drew his eye. She had waited for him to approach because she understood that being pursued feels different than pursuing, and that the difference matters to men like Callum Hale, men who have spent years being hunted. She listened carefully to every word he said that night, not just to respond, but to catalogue. She heard his exhaustion and filed it away. She heard his disgust with the penthouse life and the proximity seekers and the endless performance, and she understood what it meant. She heard a man who was already disgusted with his own reflection, a man already moving toward change, already reaching for something different, even if he couldn't name what he was reaching for. Camila did not create that desire in Callum. It was already there. It had been building for years, maybe since his father's death, maybe longer. What she did was locate it. She found the direction he was already swimming and positioned herself directly in his path. She set up residence at the address of his transformation, and then, slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understands that the biggest moves are made in increments, she began sending letters in her own name. But we're not there yet. Let him have the beginning. Let him have the bench near the coat check, and the 2 hours of honest conversation and the feeling of rest that washed over him for the first time in years. Let him have the walk to his car afterward, the way he sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, the unfamiliar sensation of looking forward to something, because the beginning was real. That's what makes the rest of it so complicated. The connection was real. The pull was real. What came later doesn't erase what existed in that gallery on a Tuesday in October. It just means that the same moment can be true from one angle and something else entirely from another. And Callum Hale was about to spend a very long time learning the difference. The 8 months before Camila moved into Callum's world were, by any reasonable measure, the most quietly significant 8 months of his adult life. Not because of her exactly, though she was present throughout, but because of what was already shifting in him, the way tectonic things shift, slowly and without announcement, until the ground above looks different and you can't quite remember when the change began. He stopped drinking heavily, not dramatically, not with a declaration or a program or a conversation about it. He simply started noticing how he felt the morning after, and started choosing differently. The penthouse parties thinned out, not because he announced a new policy, but because he stopped sending the messages that filled the rooms, and it turned out that most of the crowd had only ever been responding to his signal. When the signal changed, they drifted toward other signals. He watched this happen without particular sadness. That told him something. He started sleeping before midnight. This sounds small. It wasn't. For a man whose nervous system had been running on artificial urgency for the better part of a decade, choosing to stop before the day was fully spent was an act of genuine discipline. He began to understand that the late hours had been a hiding place, a way to stay in motion past the point where stillness might ask something of him. Stopping meant sitting with the quiet. He practiced it until it stopped feeling like deprivation. He returned calls from his father's old advisors. The first few conversations were awkward in the way that conversations are when both parties have been pretending something isn't happening for a long time. But Callum showed up for them, listened more than he spoke, and began to actually learn the architecture of what Edmund had built. He found, to his genuine surprise, that it was interesting, that the decisions his father had made over 40 years told a story about how a particular kind of mind engages with risk and patience and the long view. He started to see himself in it, which was something he had specifically avoided doing for 3 years. And he picked up a journal, a brown leather one with a worn spine, bought from a small shop he passed on a walk he took because Camila had said once, with no particular agenda, that she thought walking without a destination was one of the more underrated human activities. He started writing in it, the way anyone starts writing in a journal when they haven't done it before. Badly, self-consciously, aware of the inadequacy of words to hold what he was trying to say. But honestly, he wrote honestly, which is harder than writing well, and more valuable. He wrote about his father, about the restlessness he had carried for years without being able to name it, about the specific weight of inheriting something you didn't earn, and the complicated relationship that creates with your own sense of worth. The journal sat on his nightstand. He filled pages. He didn't show it to anyone. One evening in the spring, about 8 months into knowing Camilla, they were sitting together in his kitchen. Not the penthouse, which he had quietly begun to think of as a costume he used to wear, but the apartment he'd kept for himself in a quieter part of the city, the one that felt like him when he finally admitted what he felt like. They were eating something she had made, a simple thing, and the conversation had found one of those natural pauses that comfortable people let rest without filling. He looked across the table at her and said it with the full weight of what he meant. "You changed me." He said it like a man naming something sacred, like a man who had found the right word for a long-standing feeling and couldn't believe he'd gone so long without it. Camilla looked at him. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. And then she said, quietly, in the measured and careful way she said everything that mattered to her, "You were ready." It sounded like humility. It was actually precision, because here's what precision looks like when it's dressed in grace. It lets the other person feel seen while ensuring that the frame of the story shifts. He heard those 2 words and felt understood. He felt like she saw the truth of him, that the change had come from somewhere real. What he didn't notice was the architecture of what she'd done, which was to acknowledge his readiness while positioning herself as the necessary condition for it, not quite claiming credit, not quite conceding it either, landing in the exact place that kept both doors open. He didn't notice. Of course he didn't. He was too busy feeling, for the first time in years, like himself. That was the first theft, and he handed it to her willingly, with reverence, with both hands open. That's the part that matters. That's the part that will echo forward through everything else in this story. He wasn't deceived into giving it away. He offered it, because that's what people do when someone is present at the moment they finally find their footing. They assumed the presence caused the standing. The journal kept filling. And then, at some point that Callum wouldn't be able to pinpoint later, it disappeared from the nightstand. He assumed he'd misplaced it. He bought another one and started again. He didn't think about the first one for a long time. He should have. Have you ever given someone else credit for the work you did on yourself? Not because they asked for it, but because it felt right in the moment. Because they were there, and being there felt like enough to earn it. Think about that. Really think. Because that instinct, which comes from a genuinely generous place, is also one of the most exploitable things about people who are capable of growth. If this story is already sitting with you, that little thumbs up means more than you know. And stay close, because what comes next is where it gets complicated in ways Callum could not yet see. It was a Saturday in early June, and the family estate outside the city was doing what it only ever did on the best kind of days. It was holding the light. The old oak trees that lined the property had been there long enough to have opinions about the weather, and on this particular morning they had apparently decided to cooperate, filtering the afternoon sun through their canopy in a way that turned everything gold-green and cool and slightly unreal, the way beautiful things sometimes look when you're standing inside them and some part of your brain is already trying to memorize the feeling. White chairs in careful rows on the lawn. Camilla in ivory silk that moved when she moved, unhurried and precise, the way she moved through everything. Callum in charcoal, standing at the front with the particular stillness of a man who has decided, fully and without reservation, that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. That stillness was new, or rather, it was old, in the way that things feel old when they're actually returning rather than arriving for the first time. The restlessness that had run through him like a low current for most of his adult life had gone quiet, not suppressed, not managed, not exhausted into submission. Actually quiet. He stood in the gold-green light under the oak trees his father had loved, in front of the people who had known the Hale name for long enough to know what it meant, and he felt present. Entirely, groundedly, unreservedly present. It was such an unusual feeling for him that he had almost called it something else when he first recognized it. He had stood in front of the mirror that morning and thought, this must be what settled feels like. He was happy. Whatever the full truth of that day would later become, and history was going to complicate nearly every corner of it, he was genuinely happy in those hours. That matters. It would be easier to tell this story if he hadn't been. It would be tidier, more legible, if there had been some shadow over the morning, some note of wrongness in the air that a careful person might have noticed. But there wasn't. The day was beautiful, and his happiness was real, and that combination is precisely what made what came next so difficult to process. The ceremony had been running for perhaps 12 minutes when the disruption happened. It wasn't dramatic in the way the word disruption implies. There was no scene, no hysteria, no moment of chaos that would have given everyone present a clear story to tell later. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for being so. A woman stood up near the back of the seated rows, wearing a blue jacket that was slightly too formal for the occasion in a way that suggested she had dressed carefully for a specific purpose. Her hair was cut close. She was holding something against her chest with both hands. A thin cardboard folder, the kind you get from a copy shop, the kind you use when you need to carry something flat and important without it getting bent. She didn't scream. She wasn't unstable, didn't read as someone in crisis in the ordinary sense. She called out with the measured, deliberate urgency of someone who has decided that this is the last available moment, that every other channel has been tried and closed, and this is what remains. Her voice carried across the lawn with the particular clarity of a person who has rehearsed what they need to say until they can say it without trembling. She said Callum's name. The security staff reached her within seconds, efficiently, quietly, the way good security operates when they've been briefed to minimize rather than escalate. She was guided toward the side doors with the practiced speed of people doing a job. She didn't fight it. But on her way through, just before the doors closed behind her, she turned and looked directly at Callum. Not at the crowd, not at Camila, at him. Her face held something that his brain registered and then immediately failed to process, an expression that carried urgency and grief, and something that looked, in the half-second he had to read it, almost like apology. And then Camila's hand was on his arm, light, warm, steady, and her voice was at his ear, low and calm and carrying exactly the right note of embarrassed regret. She was a parent, Camila told him, from her old school. There had been a difficult situation a couple of years ago, a custody matter, an appeal that hadn't gone the woman's way, and she had become fixated on the administrators involved. Camila said she should have warned security specifically, should have thought to flag it, and she was sorry. She squeezed his arm once. The officiant, reading the room with professional grace, gave everyone a quiet moment before resuming. The oak trees held their light. The ceremony continued. Callum filed the moment away in the category the mind reserves for things that were startling but have now been explained, and he let himself return to being present. He believed her. Of course he believed her. Why wouldn't he? The explanation was specific and plausible and delivered without defensiveness, with exactly the right amount of personal accountability. He had no competing information. He had no reason to look for one. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the woman in the blue jacket was not a fixated parent from a custody dispute. She was the sister of a man whose name Callum had never heard, a man who had been involved with Camila during a period that overlapped, by several significant months, with the early part of Camila's relationship with Callum. A man who was, according to a DNA test that this woman had obtained through considerable personal effort and expense, the biological father of the child Camila was already carrying when she walked down that aisle in ivory silk. This woman had spent 6 weeks trying to reach Callum. She had called his office and been routed to voicemail. She had sent letters that were apparently never received. She had tried to reach his personal assistant and found a wall where a conversation should have been. The walls were not accidental. They were the product of Camila's quiet and thorough management of the space between Callum and the outside world, a management style that had been developing gradually in the way that controlling behaviors tend to develop, until it was simply the way things worked, without anyone having made a specific decision to make it so. The thin cardboard folder the woman had pressed against her chest contained copies of that test, and a letter, and a photograph. She had dressed carefully and driven 3 hours and walked past the venue entrance twice before finding a position that worked, because she had decided that a man deserved to know what he was walking into. She was escorted out before she could say 10 words, and the explanation that replaced her was so smooth and so immediate that it didn't leave a crack for doubt to get through. Now, here is the uncomfortable truth about Camilla, the one that this story requires honesty about, even though it would be simpler to paint her in cleaner colors. She was not monstrous in the way we expect monsters to look. She didn't operate from cruelty for its own sake. She was someone who had learned, early and thoroughly, that the world rewards positioning over truth, that the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. That safety, for someone who has felt profoundly unsafe, can become something you manufacture rather than something you wait to receive. She had built walls and managed stories, and positioned herself carefully for long enough that it had stopped feeling like a strategy. It had become, simply, how she moved through the world. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't make what she did to Callum excusable, or what she took from that woman defensible, but it makes it human in the worst possible way, the way that forces you to hold two true things at once. She caused real damage, and she was also someone who had learned, in the place where her damage lived, that causing it was the only way she knew how to stay standing. Callum didn't know any of this. He stood under the oak trees in his charcoal suit and smiled at his new wife and let himself be happy. Now, I know some of you are already feeling a certain way about this. And honestly, you should be. Drop it in the comments. Who do you think that woman really was the moment she stood up? And why do you think Camilla moved so fast to explain her away before Callum could form a single question? Because I think some of you already knew. I think you felt it before I confirmed it. Tell me what you're thinking. I read every one of those comments, and this conversation is always better when you're in it. Leo arrived on a Thursday morning in August, 14 months after the wedding, at 6:47 in the morning, when the sky outside the hospital was doing that specific thing it does in late summer, turning from grey to gold in increments so gradual you can't catch the exact moment of change. Only look up and discover it has already happened. Callum had been in the waiting room for 4 hours. He had drunk 3 cups of coffee he didn't taste, read the same paragraph of a magazine article 6 times without retaining a single word, and stood up and sat down so many times that the man across from him, a grandfather waiting on the same news as it turned out, had eventually looked up and given him a small nod of solidarity. When the nurse appeared in the doorway and said his name, he stood so quickly that he knocked a paper cup off the armrest beside him, sent it spinning across the floor, and didn't notice until he was already through the door. And then there was a boy, 7 pounds and a few ounces, red-faced and ancient-looking the way all new humans are, carrying in their compressed and wrinkled faces some echo of every version of themselves that hasn't happened yet. He smelled of something Callum had no word for, something clean and warm and fundamental, the smell of a person at the very beginning of their story, before the world has had a chance to add anything to them. The nurse placed the boy in Callum's arms with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to know that new fathers need the weight of it immediately, that the understanding travels through the body before it reaches the mind. Callum sat down in a plastic chair beside the bed, because his legs made the decision for him, and he looked at his son. He wept. Not politely, not the brief, manageable emotion of a man maintaining his composure while allowing himself a single dignified moment. He wept the way a person weeps when they discover that they have been carrying a capacity they never knew about, when the container they thought defined them turns out to have a second chamber, hidden, full, waiting for exactly this. His shoulders moved. His breath came in the uneven way that real grief and real joy share, because they are more similar than we generally admit. He didn't try to stop it. He sat in the plastic chair with his son in his arms and wept, and Camilla watched from the bed with an expression he would not later be able to accurately reconstruct. He named the boy Leo. He had decided on the name 3 months before, alone, during a walk. One of the destination-less walks that had become his thinking time, and he hadn't told anyone because it felt private in a way he couldn't explain. Leo, because it meant lion, because he wanted the boy, from the very first word anyone would ever use to identify him, to know what he was made of, not what he had, not where he came from, what he was made of. Leo took his first steps on the kitchen tile on a Tuesday afternoon when Callum was home early from a meeting that ended faster than expected. He came through the back door to find Leo standing at the edge of the kitchen counter, grip released, both hands out at his sides like small wings finding their angle, and then 3 steps. Deliberate, enormous, world-changing steps across the tile before sitting down with the satisfied expression of someone who has just conclusively proved a point they've been working on for weeks. Callum stood in the doorway and watched and did not move, because some moments require absolute stillness from the witness. There was the 2 a.m. nightmare, not once, not twice, but a recurring season of them. 3 weeks of nights when Leo woke with a cry that carried genuine terror in it, the kind that no 4-year-old should have to hold alone. Callum learned through trial and incremental understanding that what worked was not reassurance through words. Leo was too young and too frightened for language to reach him quickly enough. What worked was presence, sitting on the edge of the small bed, one hand steady on Leo's back, not speaking much, just being the fixed point in the room, the thing that wasn't moving, until the boy's breathing slowed and his body remembered that it was safe. Some nights this took 20 minutes. Some nights it took until the sky started doing its grey to gold thing again and Callum went to work running on 45 minutes of sleep and didn't complain about it to a single person. There was the scraped knee from the back garden that bled more than scraped knees ever seem like they should, and Leo's face going through the full sequence of shock and pain and imminent crying, before Callum crouched down to his level and said, with complete sincerity, that he had once scraped his knee in almost exactly that spot, and it had absolutely been the worst thing that had ever happened to him at that moment. And Leo had laughed through the crying in a way that broke and repaired something simultaneously. There was the first day of school, and the backpack that was nearly as large as Leo was, and the way Leo had turned at the classroom door and looked back at Callum with an expression that asked several large questions at once, and Callum had answered all of them with a nod that said, "Yes, I'll be here. Yes, this is fine. Yes, you are exactly who you need to be to walk through that door." And there were the questions about the sky. Why is it blue? Not asked once, but asked on approximately 11 separate occasions over the course of a year, as though Leo suspected the answer kept changing. Callum got it wrong 3 times before looking it up, and then explained light scattering and atmospheric particles to a 4-year-old with more patience and enthusiasm than he had brought to most board meetings. Leo listened with the gravity of a small person evaluating whether this information was satisfactory. Eventually he decided it was, and moved on to why the moon followed the car. No one gave Callum that capacity. That is the thing the narrator needs you to understand before we go any further. No one installed it in him. It was already there, had always been there, in the man who had spent his 20s running from every stillness, filling every quiet room with noise and movement and people who wanted things from him. That man, that restless, unmoored, genuinely lost man, had already possessed the ability to sit on the edge of a small bed at 2 in the morning and be still for another person. He had simply never been given, or given himself, the invitation to try. Camila received the credit for his transformation, as she had received the credit for the earlier one. He gave it to her in the same way he gave everything, openly, without calculation, because generosity was one of the things that had always been true about him, one of the things that had survived every other version of himself intact. She accepted it with the measured grace she brought to everything. And Leo simply received the love, which was real, which was not a performance and not a product of circumstance and not contingent on any document or test or piece of information that did not yet exist on a screen in a home office on a quiet evening. Completely, irreversibly, non-negotiably real. This is the part that gets me, every single time. Because fatherhood is not a blood test. It never has been. It's a decision made at 2 in the morning, when no one is watching, and nothing is required of you, and you go anyway. It's the hand on the small back. It's the crouching down to knee level. It's learning the wrong answer 3 times because you cared enough to keep trying. If you know a father like that, the kind who shows up not because biology demands it, but because love decided to, share this with him tonight. He needs to hear that what he's doing is seen, Because it absolutely is. And now you understand what was in that room when the document was open on the screen. Now you understand what 43 minutes of silence was actually holding. The genetic panel was not something Callum went looking for. It came to him the way the most consequential things tend to come. Through a side door, wearing ordinary clothes, presenting itself as something routine. Leo had been having episodes. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that announced itself as an emergency, but persistent enough to require attention. A pattern of fatigue that seemed disproportionate to how much the boy was sleeping. A sensitivity that the pediatrician wanted to investigate further. The referral to the specialist was straightforward. The specialist's recommendation for a comprehensive genetic panel was framed as standard practice, a precaution, the kind of thing responsible parents do when a thorough doctor suggests it. Callum agreed immediately. Of course he did. This was Leo. Camilla hesitated. He noticed it, registered it in the way you register a half-second of irregular rhythm in something that usually runs smoothly. But she framed it as concern, and the framing was good. She worried about Leo being anxious about tests. She worried about the process being more invasive than necessary. She said these things with the measured care she brought to everything, and Callum heard them as a mother's protective instinct, which is what they were designed to sound like. He told her gently that he wasn't willing to wait, that if there was something to know, he wanted to know it, that Leo's health didn't have a patient setting. She agreed. The appointment was scheduled. The results came back on a Tuesday evening, and there is that day again, arriving at another hinge in this story without announcement or apology. The email landed while Callum was in the Home Office, working through a contract review that had been sitting on his desk for 3 days. The subject line was clinical and unremarkable. He opened it because it was Leo's, because anything with Leo's name on it got his full attention without deliberation. He read the first section, the panel findings, the specific hereditary marker the specialist had flagged, the one that needed a parental genetic comparison to properly interpret, and then the comparison results, laid out in the careful, percentage-based language of a laboratory that charges significant money to tell you accurate things without any regard for what those accurate things will do to the person reading them. His own genetic lineage was not present in these results. We have been here before, at the very beginning of this story, and now you are back with the full weight of everything between then and now sitting in the room with you. You know what Callum built. You know what those 4 years held. The kitchen tile and the 2 a.m. bed edge and the scraped knee and the blue sky and the backpack almost as large as the boy wearing it. You know what the name Leo means and why he chose it and what he felt in that plastic chair in the hospital when the weight of a new person was placed in his arms for the first time. You know all of it now. And so when I tell you that he sat in that office chair and read those results, and his eyes slid off the words and then found them again, and then slid off again, you understand exactly what was sliding. It wasn't just information. It was the scaffolding of the last 5 years. It was the story of who he had become, and how he had become it, and what he believed about the ground beneath his feet. The physical sensation of it is hard to describe accurately, but it is important to try. It wasn't sharp, the way you might expect. It wasn't the clean, decisive feeling of something breaking. It was more like the sensation of trying to stand on a surface that has quietly, without announcement, become something other than what it appeared to be. The floor was still there. His body was still in the chair. His hands were on the desk, completely still, and he looked at them as if verifying this, as if the information in the email had made the ordinary fact of his own hands temporarily strange. From the next room, Leo's voice, clear and bright, and entirely unconcerned with whatever had just happened to the shape of the world. He was asking about the red truck. He wanted to know where it was, with the specific urgency of a child for whom the immediate and the important are the same category. And then Camilla's voice, patient, soft, telling him to check under the couch, telling him that trucks sometimes drive themselves there when no one is watching. And Leo's laugh, that particular unperformed laugh, and small feet on the floor. Callum sat with all of it for 43 minutes, which we have already established, but which now you can actually feel rather than simply know. 43 minutes of holding information that rewrites your identity while the ordinary music of your household continues around you without a single missed note. The heating system, a car outside, his son's footsteps, his wife's voice, all of it utterly, almost insultingly, continuous. He did not break anything. He did not raise his voice. He did not do any of the things that the man he used to be, the one who moved through penthouse rooms at speed, who made decisions from urgency rather than purpose, who had never learned to sit still with something difficult, might have done. The old Callum, the one from before, might have let the shock move through him as action, as noise, as something external that matched the internal scale of what he was feeling. But that man was not in the chair. The man in the chair was someone who had been built differently, rebuilt from the inside out through years of quiet and deliberate showing up. And he sat with the pain of it, the way a person sits with something that has earned the right to be held carefully. Now listen, I need you to sit with that for a moment, because this is the point where most stories would have the man explode, break things, burn it all down, make the destruction match the devastation. And I understand that impulse, I do. I understand why we expect it, and why we've been trained to read it as authentic feeling. But that is not what happened here. And the reason it didn't happen is, in many ways, the entire point of this story, because that patience, that extraordinary, costly, deliberate stillness, was not Camilla's gift to him. It was not something she had installed in him during their early months, or maintained through their marriage, or constructed in him through love. It was his. He had built it himself, in the dark, at 2 a.m, in the specific and unrepeatable work of being steady for a small person who needed steadiness more than anything else in the world. He had built it in bad answers about the sky and corrected ones. He had built it in the hand on the small back, and the nod at the classroom door, and the 45 minutes of sleep before a full day of work without one word of complaint to anyone. He had built it brick by brick in the dark where no one was keeping score, and it was entirely, irrevocably his. He just didn't know it yet. He was about to find out. He did not go to Camilla that night. He did not go to her the next morning, or the morning after that. What he did instead was something that the younger version of himself, the one who moved on instinct and noise and the urgent need to make the inside feeling visible on the outside, would not have recognized as a response at all. He went quiet. He went methodical. He went to work. The specialist's documentation was thorough, as good medical records tend to be. Genetic panels of this nature include reference markers, lineage comparisons, source data. Callum was not a scientist, but he was a man who had spent the last several years learning how to read complex documents carefully, how to follow a thread through technical language without losing the larger picture, how to sit with information that resisted easy interpretation and wait for it to become clear. His father's advisors had taught him this. In those early meetings he had finally shown up for with his full attention. He applied it now to something far more personal than a quarterly report. A name emerged through cross-referencing. It took him 2 evenings. Careful, systematic, unhurried work conducted after Leo was asleep and Camilla had gone to bed. In the home office with the door pulled mostly closed and the desk lamp making a small circle of light in the quiet room. He worked the way an investigator works when they are not yet ready to be wrong, methodically, without assumption, following each data point to its source before moving to the next one. He kept a legal pad beside the keyboard and wrote things down in longhand, because writing things down made them real in a way that a screen didn't, and he needed this to be real before he could decide what to do with it. The name he found was someone Camilla had never mentioned. Not once. In all the conversations they had shared across 5 years of a life built together, had this person appeared as a reference, an anecdote, a passing mention, which was in itself a kind of answer. People don't unsay names accidentally. Unsaying a name takes consistent, deliberate effort. It takes the same patience and precision that Camilla brought to everything. This man had been present in her life during the months immediately before the October gallery opening. The Tuesday in October when Callum had walked toward a woman standing in front of a dark canvas with a thread of gold through its center and thought he was moving toward rest. The overlap was not ambiguous. The timeline, once he had the pieces, assembled itself with the cold clarity of arithmetic. This was not a situation that had developed after the relationship with Callum began. This was something that existed before, something with a consequence that Camilla had recognized, evaluated, and then strategically managed. And Callum, with his readiness to be changed, his readiness to be loved, his readiness to step into a version of himself that finally felt true. Callum had been the most available container for that strategy. He had walked toward her willingly. He had offered himself with both hands open. He sat with this for a long time, longer than felt bearable, and then past that point into something quieter and more resolved. He did not confront her, not that night. He closed the legal pad. He turned off the desk lamp, and then, instead of going to bed, he walked down the hall and stopped in the doorway of Leo's room. The nightlight made a warm circle on the ceiling, soft and steady, the kind of light designed specifically to make a small person feel that the world is a safe and continuous thing, even in the hours when everything goes dark. Leo was on his side, one arm curved under his head, the other stretched above him on the pillow with the complete, unconsidered ease of a child who feels entirely safe. His breathing was even, his face was slack and young and entirely at peace. He looked, as he always looked when sleeping, like a person who has not yet learned to hold his body against the possibility of threat. Callum stood in the doorway and looked at his son. The biology had changed nothing about that small sleeping face, nothing about the way Leo's mouth curved at the corner in the particular way it did when something struck him as funny, nothing about the way the boy said "Dad" with exactly 2 syllables and all the ease of someone using a word that has never needed to be earned, a word so natural in his mouth. It had probably never occurred to him that it could mean anything other than the man who showed up, always, without fail, in every doorway that mattered. Fatherhood was present in that doorway, standing on 2 feet, refusing to move. If that just landed somewhere deep in you, you are not alone, not even close. Hit that like button and let me know you're still here with me, because we are not done, and where this goes next is going to ask something of you. Finding Petra took him 11 days. Not because the trail was complicated, but because he approached it the way he now approached everything that mattered, without rushing, without forcing, giving each step the time it needed to be solid before he put his weight on the next one. It started with a detail that didn't fit. A small thing, the kind that a person in pain might overlook, but that a man who has trained himself to pay attention catches and holds. In the specialist's documentation, in a section he had read 3 times without it registering, there was a reference to a previous inquiry, a request for records that had been submitted and then withdrawn, 18 months before Leo's birth. The name attached to the withdrawal wasn't Camilla's. It wasn't a name he recognized at all. But it was there, logged in the way that medical systems log everything, indifferent to the significance of what they're recording. He pulled on that thread with the same methodical patience he had brought to the legal pad and the desk lamp. He was a man who now knew there was a version of his own life he had never been shown, and that knowledge had activated something in him. Not rage, not the frantic energy of someone trying to outrun what they've discovered, but the focused, deliberate attention of someone who needs to see the whole picture before they can decide what it means. Her name was Petra, records coordinator at a school district, not Camilla's district, not even the same city, but an adjacent professional world where these things sometimes overlap. She was not unstable. She had never been a parent at Camilla's school. She had no custody dispute, no history of the kind of behavior that Camilla had described on that June afternoon under the oak trees, with her hands steady on Callum's arm, and her voice perfectly calibrated to close the question before it fully formed. The story Camilla had told was a complete fabrication, assembled in seconds with the fluency of someone who has a ready supply of plausible explanations because they have always known this day might come. Callum found a phone number. He called it on a Wednesday morning from his car, parked outside the office, with 20 minutes before a meeting he would be entirely present for, because that was who he was now. She picked up on the 3rd ring. When he said his name, there was a pause, not a long one, but waited, the pause of a person recalibrating in real time. "I've been waiting for this call for 4 years," she said. They met 2 days later. A coffee shop in a neutral neighborhood. Plain walls, old wood. The kind of place that has been there long enough to have stopped trying to impress anyone. dark roast and a corner table, and the folder that she placed on the surface between them with the careful deliberateness of someone who has carried something significant for a long time and is finally, with both relief and gravity, setting it down. She was composed, precise. She told him the sequence of events, the way a person tells something they have gone over so many times in private that the words have become the most accurate container available for the truth. She had tried to reach him 6 times before the wedding. 6 separate attempts, through different channels, with increasing urgency as the date approached. His office number, routed to an assistant who took messages that apparently went nowhere. A letter sent to the Hale Group's registered address that apparently never arrived at any desk he sat at. An email to a general inquiry address that generated an automated response, and nothing further. And then the wedding itself, which she had found through a public announcement, the last available door, and she had walked through it carrying the folder and wearing the blue jacket she had pressed the night before because she had wanted, in some way she couldn't entirely explain, to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. "Why did you keep all of it?" Callum asked. He meant the folder, the documentation, the years of holding on to something that had cost her repeated effort and produced nothing but walls. Petra looked at him across the table. "Because I knew you had a son," she said, "and I thought you deserved to know who he was, not to take him from you." She paused, making sure the next word landed cleanly. Just to know, to choose. To choose, 2 words that should have been ordinary, and were instead the most clarifying thing anyone had said to him in years. Petra had held on to the truth for 4 years because she believed he deserved the right to choose what to do with it. She had crossed every available barrier, absorbed every wall, shown up at a wedding with a cardboard folder against her chest, because she thought a man's right to choose his own story was worth that effort. And Camilla had spent those same 4 years, and the year before them, and the months before that, ensuring that the option to choose never reached him, not out of confidence that he would make the wrong choice, out of certainty that the choice itself was a risk she wasn't willing to carry. He sat with Petra for another 40 minutes. He asked questions, and she answered them without embellishment, without apparent agenda, with the straightforward reliability of someone who has simply been waiting to tell the truth to the right person. When they were done, she pushed the folder toward him and left her hand on it for a moment before releasing it. A small gesture. It said, "This is yours now. I've done what I came to do." He walked out into the afternoon. The sky was grey and low, the particular grey of a city in autumn that isn't committing to rain but isn't promising anything better. He stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop with the folder under his arm and the cold air on his face and breathed, just breathed, in and out, the ordinary mechanics of being alive, which felt, in that moment, strangely deliberate. He had not felt this real in a very long time. Now, I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. Do you think Petra did the right thing by holding on to that documentation for 4 years? Or should she have pushed harder, found another way, refused to let the walls stop her? There is no clean answer, and I think you know that, which is exactly why I want you in the comments making the case. And if you have stayed with me this far, hit that subscribe button right now, because where this goes next, the decision Callum makes when he walks back through his own front door, is the part that is going to stay with you. You need to be here for it. He chose a Sunday morning. Leo was at a neighbor's house, a planned playdate that Callum had confirmed the week before with the quiet foresight of a man arranging the conditions he needed. The house was still. The kitchen was full of the ordinary light of a late autumn morning, the kind that comes in low and even and makes everything look considered, deliberate, like a photograph of a life rather than the life itself. He placed the folder on the kitchen table, set it down without drama, without force, without any of the theatrical weight the moment might have invited, just placed it there, in the center of the table, and stepped back. Camilla came in from the hallway and stopped. She looked at the folder. And this is the detail that Callum would remember longest, would return to in the months ahead when he was trying to make sense of the full architecture of what had happened between them. She did not look shocked. She looked at the folder the way a person looks at something they have been expecting for a long time. The way someone looks when a suspended moment finally, after years of waiting in the air, completes itself and lands. There was no performance in her face in that instant, no calculation assembling behind her eyes, just the strange, almost physical relief of a thing that has been held in suspension finally being released. "How much do you know?" she asked. "All of it." She sat down, not the controlled, deliberate way she usually moved through space, the way that always suggested she had chosen this position, this posture, this arrangement of herself in a room. She sat the way a person sits when the effort required to remain standing has simply exceeded what's available. Her hands came together on the table in front of her, not folded neatly but loosely, without architecture. And for the first time in the 8 years Callum had known her, the 8 years across which he had learned to read her precision the way you learn to read a language, she stopped managing the room. The shift was subtle and enormous. Her shoulders carried something they didn't usually carry, which was their own weight, the careful arrangement that was always present between her face and what her face was doing, went somewhere he couldn't locate. What remained underneath was not what he had expected. He had braced, in the days of building toward this moment, for the possibility of more strategy, for a new explanation, a reframe, another version of the story delivered with the practiced fluency he had come to understand as her primary language. What he found instead was exhaustion, the deep, structural exhaustion of a person who has been performing themselves, not just for others, but for themselves, for so long that the performance has become load-bearing, and removing it reveals how tired the person underneath has been all along. He felt something move through him that he had not anticipated. Not love. That particular version of love had ended somewhere in the 11 days of quiet investigation, somewhere in the corner coffee shop with the folder on the old wood table, and Petra's composed, patient voice laying out the facts. But something adjacent to understanding. The recognition, painful and genuine, of a fellow lost person, someone who had never found their footing in themselves and had spent years constructing the appearance of it from the outside in. He had been that person once. He knew what it looked like from the inside. He knew what it cost. He didn't say any of that. He let the silence hold for a moment, and then he asked the thing he had come to ask, the only question he had decided that actually mattered. "I'm not going to destroy you publicly," he said. His voice was even, not cold, even, which is different, and harder. "I'm not going to pursue every legal avenue available to me, and there are several. I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Tell me honestly, did you ever believe I needed you? Or did you just need me to believe it?" She looked at him. The silence between the question and her answer was long enough that he thought, for a moment, she might not respond at all, that she might reach even now for the management of it. But she didn't. "I thought the version of you I was building was better than the one you would have found on your own," she said. Her voice was quiet in a way he had never heard it before, stripped of its usual calibration, carrying only what it actually held. "I thought I was necessary." He stood with that for a moment. Let it exist in the room without rushing toward it or away from it. "That's the saddest thing you've ever said to me," he told her. And he meant it with a completeness that had no anger in it, just the clean, clear weight of a true thing. "Because I didn't need to be built. I needed to be trusted." She had no answer. For the first time in 8 years of knowing a woman who always had an answer, who had one ready before the question finished forming, who could construct a response in the space between one heartbeat and the next, there was simply nothing. Her mouth didn't move toward words. Her eyes stayed on the table. The silence was not dramatic. It was just final, the way certain silences are, the ones that close something rather than hold it open. He let it stand. And then, because it was the only thing left to say, he said it. "I'm keeping Leo." Not as a threat, not as a negotiation opening. As a statement of fact, the kind that doesn't require argument or elaboration or the other party's agreement to be true. Leo was his son. He had decided this not in the kitchen on this Sunday morning, but in a doorway weeks ago, looking at a small sleeping face in warm light, with the full weight of 4 years of presence behind him. The biology had been irrelevant since that moment in the doorway. He was simply saying out loud what had already been settled somewhere deeper than words reach. Camilla didn't dispute it. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands loosely together and said nothing. And that said everything. "Write this down if you need to. Find somewhere to put it. where you'll see it again. I didn't need to be built, I needed to be trusted. Because that line is not only Callum's. That line belongs to every person who has ever watched someone else collect credit for the work they did quietly, in the dark, on themselves. Every person who was told, explicitly or through implication, that they owed their becoming to someone else's presence. That line is yours if you need it. Take it. Forgiveness didn't arrive the way he might have expected it to. There was no morning when he woke up and decided, no conversation, no moment of clarity delivered cleanly from one state of being into another. It came the way winter comes to the end of itself, not with a declaration, not with a single warm day that announces the change, but with a gradual, almost unnoticed shift in the quality of the air. 1 week, the cold is all there is. And then, without ceremony, it simply begins to be less. He noticed it first in the small things. The way her name, which had lived in his chest for months with a particular weight attached to it, began to feel lighter when it surfaced. The way he could drive past the neighborhood where they had lived without the tightening in his shoulders that had been his body's automatic response for the better part of a year. The way Leo could mention her, casually the way children mention things that are simply part of the landscape of their lives. And Callum could respond with the ordinary, present attention of a father, rather than the managed stillness of a man keeping something contained. He had not forgiven her because she deserved it. He was honest enough with himself, by this point, to hold that clearly. The harm was real. The years of managed narrative, the walls built around him, the choice removed from him before he ever knew it was his to make. None of that had become smaller or less consequential with time. Forgiveness was not a verdict on what she had done. It was not absolution. It was not the closing of a case. It was a decision about what he was willing to carry into the rest of his life. Because anger has a cost that people underestimate when they're in the middle of it. It presents itself as energy, as fuel, as the thing that keeps you moving forward. And in the early months, it had been exactly that, the force that got him. Through the legal proceedings and the sleepless nights and the mornings when the parking lot view outside the apartment window was just a parking lot and nothing more, but sustained anger is expensive in the way that running on urgency is expensive. It spends something real, something that doesn't replenish easily, and the bill always arrives eventually. He felt it in the jaw tension his dentist would eventually note, in the sleep that still came unevenly. In the moments during Leo's weeks away when the quiet of the apartment had an edge to it that he had to consciously, deliberately soften, bitterness cost him presence. And presence was the only currency that actually mattered now. It was what Leo needed from him on Friday evenings with the peanut butter toast and the badly illustrated picture books. It was what the Hale Group's renewed strategy required. He had begun, quietly and with the full attention he now knew how to bring, to rebuild what the legal dissolution had reduced. And rebuilding requires a kind of forward-facing clarity that bitterness makes impossible. He could not be fully in the room with his son and simultaneously occupied in the locked chamber where resentment lives. The two things could not coexist without one of them losing, and he had already decided which one he was unwilling to sacrifice. So he let her down, not dramatically, not with a phone call or a letter or any gesture that required her participation or her awareness. He simply, over the course of weeks that blurred into each other at the edges, released the grip. He let her down from the place she had occupied in his chest for 8 years, the place where she had lived like a stone he had agreed to carry, first with love, and then with grief, and then with anger, and which had been his to set down all along. He set the stone down. He kept walking. Forgiveness without reunion, no reconciliation, no reopened door, no softening of the legal or personal boundaries that now defined the shape of their coexistence as Leo's parents. Just the private, interior act of releasing a person from the position of primary tenant in your own chest. The clearest mercy, the hardest kind, the kind that asks nothing of the person being forgiven and gives everything back to the one who forgives. Forgiveness without reunion, that might be the hardest thing a person can do. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that comes with an apology and a reason and a clear path forward. The quiet kind, the kind you do alone for yourself in the ordinary middle of a Tuesday that looks like every other Tuesday. Have you ever had to do that? Have you ever had to set someone down, not because they made it easy, but because carrying them had become the thing standing between you and the rest of your life? Tell me in the comments. I think more people have been in that place than ever say so out loud. The legal dissolution took 7 months. This is the part of the story that gets compressed in the retelling. Some papers signed, a few tense exchanges across a conference table, and then the protagonist emerging on the other side, slightly leaner and more determined, ready for whatever comes next. The reality was slower and more grinding than that. And it is worth sitting with the reality for a moment, because the reality is where the truth lives. Camilla had been incorporated into the Hale business interests in ways that Callum's advisors, those careful men with their conservative suits and their long memories, now walked him through with the particular expression of people who had seen this before and had not been in a position to say so at the time. Jointly held property, accounts she had access to that had grown, over 5 years of marriage, into something substantial. Business interests where her name sat alongside his in the documentation in ways that required careful legal untangling rather than clean severance. The process was expensive in money and in time, and in the specific energy that prolonged legal proceedings drain from a person. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, like a slow leak in something that needs to stay pressurized. He moved into the apartment in the 3rd month of the process. It was smaller than anything he had lived in since his early 20s. A deliberate choice, not a defeat, though the distinction didn't always feel clean in the first weeks. 2 bedrooms, because Leo needed a room. A second-hand sofa in a particular shade of brownish green that he bought from a neighbor 2 blocks away who was moving and needed it gone by Friday. A window in the living room that looked out onto a parking lot rather than the bay view he had grown accustomed to, and which turned out, on certain evenings when the light moved across it at the right angle, to have its own version of something worth looking at. Not the same, just its own. The physical toll was real, and he didn't pretend otherwise. Stress lives in the body with more honesty than it lives in the mind, and his body was keeping thorough records. His shoulders carried tension that didn't fully release even in sleep, which had become lighter and less reliable than it used to be. There was something in his jaw that his dentist would eventually mention. The physical evidence of nights spent holding things carefully that the body wanted to put down. He looked older. He knew this because he could see it, and because Leo, with the unfiltered candor of a child, had looked at him one morning and said, with genuine curiosity rather than cruelty, that he had lines on his face that weren't there before. "Those are thinking lines," Callum told him. Leo considered this with the gravity he brought to new information. "What were you thinking about?" "You," Callum said, which was true. Leo seemed to find this satisfactory and moved on to the more pressing matter of whether they had the right kind of cereal. He felt more real than he had in years. This is the part that doesn't fit the expected narrative of loss. The part where the story is supposed to be about diminishment, about what was taken, about the distance between the penthouse view and the parking lot. But the unexpected truth of those months, the thing Callum would eventually be able to say without irony or performance, was that the smaller life fit him in a way the larger one never quite had. The larger one had been a costume that happened to be very well made. This one was his actual size. On alternating weeks, Leo came, and when Leo came, the apartment changed its character entirely. It smelled of peanut butter toast, Leo's current preferred food, requested with the consistency of someone who has found the right thing and sees no reason to keep looking. The brownish-green sofa held both of them on Friday evenings in the specific arrangement they had developed without discussing it. Leo's feet across Callum's lap, the television on at a volume low enough that they could talk over it, and frequently did. Callum read picture books in the voice he had discovered made Leo dissolve. Not the polite laughter of a child performing amusement for an adult, but the real thing, the helpless, whole-body laughter of someone who is completely, exactly where they are supposed to be. The books were badly illustrated, and the plots were often difficult to follow, and Callum read them with the full commitment of a man who has decided that this is, without question, the most important performance of his life. He understood something in those evenings that he could not have understood before. He had never needed Camilla's version of him. The curated, credit-managed, carefully positioned version that had been assembled with such precision over 8 years. He had needed this, the actual weight of a child's feet across his lap, the actual smallness of a space that required nothing from him except that he'd show up and stay. The actual smell of peanut butter toast on a Friday evening. This was not a reduced life. This was the actual one. She hadn't built a man. She had convinced a man to rent his own character back to her. That's the sentence. That's the whole thing, distilled. Everything she had positioned herself to take credit for. The stillness, the patience, the capacity for love, the ability to sit with difficult things rather than outrun them, had always been his. She had found it, named it as her contribution, and collected on it for years. And he had paid, willingly and with genuine gratitude, because he hadn't yet understood that the account was already in his name. Friends, I need you to hear that one more time. She hadn't built a man. She had convinced a man to rent his own character back to her. If that line doesn't deserve to be shared, if there isn't someone in your life who needs to hear that tonight, then I don't know what does. Send this to them, right now, while you're thinking of them. Because some people are sitting somewhere tonight paying rent on themselves, and they don't even know it yet. It was a Tuesday. Of course it was. 3 months into the apartment, with the parking lot view. 2 weeks after the final legal proceeding had concluded, and the last document had been signed, and the long, grinding machinery of the dissolution had finally gone quiet. The silence it left behind was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. The silence of a thing that has been finished, rather than the silence of a thing being held at bay. Callum had learned by now to tell the difference. He was coming back from the corner store 2 blocks away, the one he had started using instead of the large supermarket, because the walk did something useful for him, gave him 20 minutes in each direction that belonged to no one, and required nothing. He carried a paper bag with the specific, modest contents of a life that had been stripped to what actually mattered. Bread, coffee, and the particular brand of peanut butter that Leo had deemed acceptable after a 3-week evaluation process that Callum had treated with the seriousness it deserved. He almost didn't notice the boy. He was sitting on the concrete barrier at the far edge of the parking lot, the one that separated the lot from the narrow strip of grass that ran along the street. A backpack on the ground beside him that was clearly sized for someone who had been told to carry more than a child that age should reasonably carry, the kind of heavy that makes a small body look compressed under it, even when it's been set down. He was not crying. He was not doing anything that announced itself as a problem. He was simply sitting with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is the safest available option. His face held the expression of someone who stopped expecting to be noticed long enough ago that the not expecting has become its own kind of invisible. Callum stopped walking. He stood there for a moment with the paper bag in his hand and looked at the boy and felt something move through him that was not dramatic and was not complicated. It was simply the response of a man who had spent 4 years learning to pay attention to small people, to read the specific frequencies that children broadcast when they need something and don't have the language or the safety to ask for it directly. He walked over, not quickly, not with the energy of someone about to fix something, just steadily, the way he moved through things now. He stopped a comfortable distance away, not crowding, not performing concern for anyone who might be watching, just present in the way he had learned to be present, fully, without agenda, without the need for the other person to respond in any particular way. "You need somewhere to be?" he asked. The boy looked up at him. The evaluation was quick and practiced, and said something about how many times this child had needed to assess an approaching adult in terms of safety. "I'm fine," he said. "I asked if you need somewhere to be," Callum said. No edge in it, no correction, just the same question again, offered with the patience of a man who had learned that the first answer a guarded person gives is almost never the whole answer, and that the right response to that is not to push, but to simply remain available. The boy looked at him for a longer moment this time. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a decision yet, but was the thing that comes just before one. "Not really," he said. Callum nodded. And then he sat down on the concrete barrier, not beside the boy in a way that felt like encroachment, just near enough to be company, far enough to leave room. He set the paper bag on the ground. He looked out at the parking lot, which in the late afternoon light was doing its occasional, unassuming thing of being slightly more than it appeared. They sat in the cold together. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling, the kind that two people can share without either of them needing to explain why they're not talking. Then Callum said, without looking over, in the same even voice he used for everything that mattered, "I'm making peanut butter toast, if you want." The boy was quiet. Callum didn't rush him. He had learned, in 4 years of doorways and small beds and 2 a.m. darkness, that some decisions need exactly the amount of time they need, and not a moment less. The boy looked at him again. The full, careful, measuring look of a child who has been let down enough times to take the measurements seriously. Whatever he found in Callum's face, the thinking lines, the steadiness, the complete absence of urgency or agenda, it apparently passed. He reached down, picked up the heavy backpack, stood up, and walked toward the building without a word. Callum picked up the paper bag and walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind, beside. That is where we leave him tonight, not at the Triumph. Not at the moment the Hale Group's numbers turned back in the right direction, which they did, quietly, steadily, the way things move when a man who finally understands his own instincts decides to trust them. Not at the rebuilt portfolio or the new office, or the moment his father's oldest advisor looked across a conference table and said, with the economy of a man who chooses his words carefully, that Edmund would have been pleased. Not at any of the large, visible, documentable markers of a life reassembled. At peanut butter toast. At a concrete barrier at the edge of a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn. At the moment, a man who had walked through the kind of fire that leaves marks looked at a child carrying more weight than a child should carry, and didn't calculate the cost of stopping, and didn't look for an audience, and didn't wait for someone to tell him it was the right thing to do. He just stopped. He just sat down. He just offered what he had. That is where the story lives. Not in the wreckage, and not in the recovery, but in the small, ordinary choices a person makes when there is nothing to gain, and no one to witness it. And the only available reason to act is that you simply see someone who needs a place to be, and you happen to have one. That is who Callum Hale always was. Through the penthouse years, and the restlessness, and the impulsive decisions, and the long season of handing credit to someone who positioned herself to receive it. Through the gallery on a Tuesday in October, and the 8 months of real change, and the kitchen table conversation, and the 43 minutes of silence in the Home Office with a medical document on the screen, through all of it, in all of its forms, the capacity was always there. He just had to lose everything, the empire and the marriage, and the version of himself he'd been borrowing from someone else's narrative, to find out that it had never belonged to anyone but him. But this fire still has questions it hasn't answered, and I want you to sit with them, because they are the ones that matter most going forward. Who is the boy in the parking lot? Because the city is large, and the parking lot is specific, and things that look like coincidence in stories like this are rarely as simple as they appear. What do we actually know about the biological father? And does he know about Leo? What was in the rest of Petra's documentation, in the parts of the folder that the story hasn't opened yet? Did anyone in Callum's inner circle, the advisors, the people who had known the Hale name long enough to have seen patterns forming, know something and choose for their own reasons to stay quiet? And what was Callum writing in that brown leather journal that disappeared from his nightstand before he ever noticed it was gone? Where is it now? Who has it? What did it say? And the question that sits underneath all the others, the one that will require the most careful handling when the time comes. Will Leo ever learn the truth? And if he does, who will be the one to tell him? Come back next time, because this fire is still going, and those questions are not decorative. They are the load-bearing walls of what comes next, and what comes next is going to ask something of you. If this story moved you tonight, and I believe it did, do one thing before you go. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming, and share this with one person who needs to hear it tonight. Not because it's entertainment, though it is that too, but because stories like this one are reminders. Reminders that the person you worked hardest to become has always been yours, that no one can build you without your cooperation, that the most important work happens in the dark at 2 in the morning when no one is watching and nothing is required and you show up anyway. Reminders of who we already are, if we're brave enough to stop letting someone else tell us. And before you go, I need your theories. Who do you think that boy is? sitting on the concrete barrier with the heavy backpack and the face of someone who stopped expecting to be noticed? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know what you're seeing. Because sometimes the people listening see things the narrator hasn't said yet. And this story is far from over. I'll see you next time, friends. Stay close to the fire.